Hello there, and welcome to this reading of Twilight Eclipse as a bedtime story to help you get down to sleep, with relaxing rain sounds in the background to really set the scene and help you drift off. If you're new here, I'm Mad Morph. I'm a content creator, and this is my podcast called Down to Sleep, where I read books to you. Welcome. Please do hit like and subscribe for more free readings, and there are even more free episodes on the main channel and on Spotify and everywhere you get podcasts. Alternatively, you can join me on Patreon for a few dollars a month and you get access to all of the exclusive books and readings that I can no longer share on YouTube. So if you're missing Coraline or you want to continue with The Lord of the Rings or hear Howl's Moving Castle, that is the best place to do it. You can find the links for all of that and the rest of what I do in the description below this video. And now, let's tuck you in. Take a nice deep breath for me. And let's get down to sleep. Eclipse by Stephanie Meyer. I noticed other faces too, the faces of my classmates. I noticed how their eyes widened as they took in all 6 foot 7 inches of Jacob's long body, muscled up the way no normal 16-and-a-half-year-old had ever been. I saw those eyes rake over his tight black t-shirt, short-sleeved, though the day was unseasonably cool. His ragged, grease-smeared jeans, and the glossy black bike he leaned against. Their eyes didn't linger on his face. Something about his expression had them glancing quickly away. And I noticed the wide berth everyone gave him, the bubble of space that no one dared to encroach on. With a sense of astonishment, I realized that Jacob looked dangerous to them. How odd. Edward stopped a few yards away from Jacob, and I could tell he was uncomfortable having me so close to a werewolf. He drew his hand back slightly, pulling me halfway behind his body. "You could have called us," Edward said in a steel-hard voice. "Sorry," Jacob answered, his face twisting into a sneer. "I don't have any leeches on my speed dial." "You could have reached me at Bella's house, of course." Jacob's jaw flexed, and his brows pulled together. He didn't answer. "This is hardly the place, Jacob. Could we discuss this later?" Sure, I'll stop by your crypt after school," Jacob snorted. "What's wrong with now?" Edward looked around pointedly, his eyes resting on the witnesses who were just barely out of hearing range. A few people were hesitating on the sidewalk, their eyes bright with expectation, like they were hoping a fight might break out to alleviate the tedium of another Monday morning. I saw Tyler Crowley nudge Austin Marks, and they both paused on their way to class. "I already know what you came to say," Edward reminded Jacob in a voice so low that I could barely make it out. "Message delivered. Consider us warned." Edward glanced down at me for a fleeting second with worried eyes. "Warned?" I asked blankly. "What are you talking about?" "You didn't tell her?" Jacob asked, his eyes widening with disbelief. "What? Were you worried she'd take our side?" "Please, drop it, Jacob," Edward said in an even voice. "Why?" Jacob challenged. I frowned in confusion. "What don't I know, Edward?" Edward just glared at Jacob, as if he hadn't heard me. "Jake?" Jacob raised his eyebrow at me. "He didn't tell you that his big brother crossed the line Saturday night?" His tone was thickly layered with sarcasm. His eyes flickered back to Edward. "Paul was totally justified in—" "It was no man's land," Edward hissed. "Was not." Jacob was fuming visibly. His hands trembled. He shook his head and sucked in 2 deep lungfuls of air. "Emmett and Paul?" I whispered. Paul was Jacob's most volatile pack brother. He was the one who had lost control that day in the woods. The memory of the snarling grey wolf was suddenly vivid in my head. "What happened? Were they fighting?" My voice strained higher in panic. Why? Did Paul get hurt? No one fought, Edward said quietly, only to me. No one got hurt. Don't be anxious. Jacob was staring at us with incredulous eyes. You didn't tell her anything at all, did you? Is that why you took her away? So she wouldn't know that? Leave, now. Edward cut him off mid-sentence. His face was abruptly frightening. Truly frightening. For a second he looked like a vampire. He glared at Jacob with vicious, unveiled loathing. Jacob raised his eyebrows but made no other move. Why haven't you told her? They faced each other in silence for a long moment. More students gathered behind Tyler and Austin. I saw Mike next to Ben. Mike had one hand on Ben's shoulder like he was holding him in place. In the dead silence, all the details suddenly fell into place for me with a burst of intuition. Something Edward didn't want me to know. Something that Jacob wouldn't have kept from me. Something that had the Cullens and the wolves both in the woods moving in hazardous proximity to each other. Something that would cause Edward to insist that I fly across the country. Something that Alice had seen in a vision last week. A vision Edward had lied to me about. Something I'd been waiting for anyway. Something I knew would happen again. As much as I might wish it never would. It was never going to end, was it? I heard the quick gasp, gasp, gasp of the air dragging through my lips, but I couldn't stop it. It looked like the school was shaking, like there was an earthquake, but I knew it was my own trembling that caused the illusion. She came back for me, I choked out. Victoria was never going to give up till I was dead. She would keep repeating the same pattern. Faint and run, faint and run, until she found a hole through my defenders. Maybe I'd get lucky. Maybe the Volturi would come for me first. They'd kill me quicker at least. Edward held me tight to his side, angling his body so he was still between me and Jacob, and stroked my face with anxious hands. It's fine, he whispered to me. It's fine. I'll never let her get close to you. It's fine. Then he glared at Jacob. Does that answer your question, mongrel? You don't think Bella has a right to know? Jacob challenged. It's her life. Edward kept his voice muted. Even Tyler, edging forward by inches, would be unable to hear. Why should she be frightened when she was never in danger? Better frightened than lied to. I tried to pull myself together, but my eyes were swimming in moisture. I could see it behind my lids. I could see Victoria's face, her lips pulled back over her teeth, her crimson eyes glowing with the obsession of her vendetta. She held Edward responsible for the demise of her love, James. She wouldn't stop until his love was taken from him too. Edward wiped the tears from my cheeks with his fingertips. Do you really think hurting her is better than protecting her? He murmured. She's tougher than you think, Jacob said. And she's been through worse. Abruptly, Jacob's expression shifted, and he was staring at Edward with an odd, speculative expression. His eyes narrowed like he was trying to do a difficult math problem in his head. I felt Edward cringe. I glanced up at him, and his face was contorted in what could only be pain. For one ghastly moment, I was reminded of our afternoon in Italy, in the macabre tower room of the Volturi where Jane had tortured Edward with her malignant gift. burning him with her thoughts alone. The memory snapped me out of near hysteria and put everything in perspective. Because I'd rather Victoria killed me 100 times over than watch Edward suffer that way again. "That's funny," Jacob said, laughing as he watched Edward's face. Edward winced, but smoothed his expression with a little effort. He couldn't quite hide the agony in his eyes. I glanced, wide-eyed from Edward's grimace to Jacob's sneer. "What are you doing to him?" I demanded. "It's nothing, Bella," Edward told me quietly. "Jacob just has a good memory, that's all." Jacob grinned and Edward winced again. "Stop it, whatever you're doing." "Sure, if you want," Jacob shrugged. "It's his own fault if he doesn't like the things I remember, though." I glared at him, and he smiled back impishly, like a kid caught doing something he knows he shouldn't by someone who he knows won't punish him. "The principal's on his way to discourage loitering on school property," Edward murmured to me. "Let's get to English, Bella, so you're not involved." "Overprotective, isn't he?" Jacob said, talking just to me. "A little trouble makes life fun. Let me guess, you're not allowed to have fun, are you?" Edward glowered, and his lips pulled back from his teeth ever so slightly. "Shut up, Jake," I said. Jacob laughed. "That sounds like a no. Hey, if you ever feel like having a life again, you could come see me. I've still got your motorcycle in my garage." This news distracted me. "You were supposed to sell that. You promised Charlie you would." If I hadn't begged on Jake's behalf, after all he'd put weeks of labor into both motorcycles, he deserved some kind of payback. Charlie would have thrown my bike in a dumpster and possibly set that dumpster on fire. Yeah, right. Like I would do that. It belongs to you, not me. Anyway, I'll hold on to it till you want it back. A tiny hint of the smile I remembered was suddenly playing around the edges of his lips. "Jake." He leaned forward, his face earnest now, the bitter sarcasm fading. "I think I might have been wrong before, you know? About not being able to be friends. Maybe we could manage it, on my side of the line. Come see me." I was vividly conscious of Edward, his arms still wrapped protectively around me, motionless as a stone. I shot a look at his face. It was calm, patient. I don't know about that, Jake." Jacob dropped the antagonistic facade completely. It was like he'd forgotten Edward was there, or at least he was determined to act that way. "I miss you every day, Bella. It's not the same without you." "I know, and I'm sorry, Jake, He shook his head and sighed. "I know. Doesn't matter, right? I guess I'll survive or something. Who needs friends?" He grimaced, trying to cover the pain with a thin attempt at bravado. Jacob's suffering had always triggered my protective side. It was not entirely rational. Jacob was hardly in need of any physical protection I could offer. But my arms, pinned beneath Edward's, yearned to reach out to him, to wrap around his big warm waist in a silent promise of acceptance and comfort. Edward's shielding arms had become restraints. "Okay, get to class," a stern voice sounded behind us. "Move along, Mr. Crowley." "Get to school, Jake," I whispered, anxious as soon as I recognized the principal's voice. Jacob went to the Quill Youth School, but he might still get in trouble for trespassing or the equivalent. Edward released me, taking just my hand and pulling me behind his body again. Mr. Green pushed through the circle of spectators, his brows pressing down like ominous storm clouds over his small eyes. "I mean it," he was threatening. "Detention for anyone who's still standing here when I turn around again." The audience melted away before he was finished with his sentence. "Ah, Mr. Cullen, do we have a problem here?" "Not at all, Mr. Green. We were just on our way to class." "Excellent. I don't seem to recognize your friend." Mr. Green turned his glower on Jacob. "Are you a new student here?" Mr. Green's eyes scrutinized Jacob, and I could see that he'd come to the same conclusion everyone else had. Dangerous. A troublemaker. "No," Jacob answered, half a smirk on his broad lips. "Then I suggest you remove yourself from school property at once, young man, before I call the police." Jacob's little smirk became a full-blown grin, and I knew he was picturing Charlie showing up to arrest him. This grin was too bitter, too full of mocking to satisfy me. This wasn't the smile I'd been waiting to see. Jacob said, "Yes, sir," and snapped a military salute before he climbed on his bike and kicked it to a start right there on the sidewalk. The engine snarled, and then the tires squealed as he spun it sharply around. In a matter of seconds, Jacob raced out of sight. Mr. Green gnashed his teeth together while he watched the performance. "Mr. Cullen, I expect you to ask your friend to refrain from trespassing again." "He's no friend of mine, Mr. Green, but I'll pass along the warning." Mr. Green pursed his lips. Edward's perfect grades and spotless record were clearly a factor in Mr. Green's assessment of the incident. "I see. If you're worried about any trouble, I'd be happy to—" "There's nothing to worry about, Mr. Green. There won't be any trouble." "I hope that's correct. Well then, on to class. You too, Miss Swan." Edward nodded and pulled me quickly along toward the English building. "Do you feel well enough to go to class?" he whispered when we were past the principal. "Yes," I whispered back, not quite sure if this was a lie. Whether I felt well or not was hardly the most important consideration. I needed to talk to Edward right away. An English class wasn't the ideal place for the conversation I had in mind. But with Mr. Green right behind us, there weren't a lot of other options. We got to class a little late and took our seats quickly. Mr. Bertie was reciting a frost poem. He ignored our entrance, refusing to let us break his rhythm. I yanked a blank page out of my notebook and started writing. My handwriting more illegible than normal thanks to my agitation. "What happened? Tell me everything, and screw the protecting me crap, please." I shoved the note at Edward. He sighed, and then began writing. It took him less time than me, though he wrote an entire paragraph in his own personal calligraphy before he slipped the paper back. "Alice saw that Victoria was coming back. I took you out of town merely as a precaution. There was never a chance that she would have gotten anywhere close to you. Emmett and Jasper very nearly had her, but Victoria seems to have some instinct for evasion. She escaped, right down the Quill boundary line, as if she were reading it from a map. It didn't help that Alice's abilities were nullified by the Quiute's involvement. To be fair, the Quiutes might have had her too if we hadn't gotten in the way. The big grey one thought Emmett was over the line, and he got defensive. Of course, Rosalie reacted to that, and everyone left the chase to protect their companions. Carlisle and Jasper got things calmed down before it got out of hand. But by then, Victoria had slipped away. That's everything. I frowned at the letters on the page. All of them had been in on it. Emmett, Jasper, Alice, Rosalie and Carlisle, maybe even Esme, though he hadn't mentioned her. And then Paul and the rest of the Quill pack. It might so easily have turned into a fight, pitting my future family and my old friends against each other. Any of them could have been hurt. I imagined the wolves would be in the most danger, but picturing tiny Alice next to one of the huge werewolves, fighting, I shuddered. Carefully, I scrubbed out the entire paragraph with my eraser, and then I wrote over the top. What about Charlie? She could have been after him. Edward was shaking his head before I finished, obviously going to downplay any danger on Charlie's behalf. He held a hand out, but I ignored that and started again. You can't know that she wasn't thinking that, because you weren't here. Florida was a bad idea then. He took the paper from underneath my hand. I wasn't about to send you off alone. With your luck, not even the black box would survive. That wasn't what I had meant at all. I hadn't thought of going without him. I'd meant that we should have stayed here together. But I was sidetracked by his response and a little miffed. Like I couldn't fly across country without bringing the plane down. Very funny. So let's say my bad luck did crash the plane. What exactly were you going to do about it? Why is the plane crashing? He was trying to hide a smile now. The pilots are passed out drunk. Easy. I'd fly the plane. Of course, I pursed my lips and tried again. Both engines have exploded and we're falling in a death spiral toward the Earth. I'd wait till we were close enough to the ground, get a good grip on you, kick out the wall and jump. Then I'd run you back to the scene of the accident and we'd stumble around like two of the luckiest survivors in history. I stared at him, wordlessly. What? He whispered. I shook my head in awe. Nothing, I mouthed. I scrubbed out the disconcerting conversation and wrote one more line. You will tell me next time. I knew there would be a next time. The pattern would continue until someone lost. Edward stared into my eyes for a long moment. I wondered what my face looked like. It felt cold, so the blood hadn't returned to my cheeks. My eyelashes were still wet. He sighed, and then nodded once. Thanks. The paper disappeared from under my hand. I looked up, blinking in surprise, just as Mr. Bertie came down the aisle. Is that something you'd like to share there, Mr. Cullen? Edward looked up innocently and held out the sheet of paper on top of his folder. My notes? He asked, sounding confused. Mr. Bertie scanned the notes, no doubt a perfect transcription of his lecture, and then walked away, frowning. It was later in calculus, my one class without Edward, that I heard the gossip. My money's on the big Indian, someone was saying. I peeked up to see that Tyler, Mike, Austin, and Ben had their heads bent together, deep in conversation. Yeah, Mike whispered. Did you see the size of that Jacob kid? I think he could take Cullen down. Mike sounded pleased by the idea. I don't think so, Ben disagreed. There's something about Edward. He's always so confident. I have a feeling he can take care of himself. I'm with Ben, Tyler agreed. Besides, if that other kid messed Edward up, you know those big brothers of his would get involved. Have you been down to the push lately? Mike asked. Lauren and I went to the beach a couple of weeks ago, and believe me, Jacob's friends are all just as big as he is." "Huh," Tyler said. "Too bad it didn't turn into anything. Guess we'll never know how it would have turned out." "It didn't look over to me," Austin said. "Maybe we'll get to see." Mike grinned. "Anyone in the mood for a bet? 10 on Jacob, 10 on Cullen, 10 on Edward." "Hey, do you guys know what it was about?" Austin wondered. "That might affect the odds." "I can guess," Mike said, and he shot a glance at me at the same time that Ben and Tyler did. From their expressions, none of them had realized I was in easy hearing distance. They all looked away, quickly, shuffling the papers on their desks. "I still say Jacob," Mike muttered under his breath. I was having a bad week. I knew that essentially nothing had changed. Okay, so Victoria had not given up. But had I ever dreamed for one moment that she had? Her reappearance had only confirmed what I'd already known. No reason for fresh panic. In theory. Not panicking was easier said than done. Graduation was only a few weeks away, but I wondered if it wasn't a little foolish to sit around, weak and tasty, waiting for the next disaster. It seemed too dangerous to be human, just begging for trouble. Someone like me shouldn't be human. Someone with my luck ought to be a little less helpless. But no one would listen to me. Carlyle had said, "There are 7 of us, Bella, and with Alice on our side, I don't think Victoria's going to catch us off guard. I think it's important for Charlie's sake that we stick with the original plan." Esme had said, "We'd never allow anything to happen to you, sweetheart. You know that. Please don't be anxious." And then she'd kissed my forehead. Emmett had said, "I'm really glad Jasper didn't kill you. Everything's so much more fun with you around." Rosalie had glared at him. Alice had rolled her eyes and said, "I'm offended. You're not honestly worried about this, are you?" "If it's no big deal, then why did Edward drag me to Florida?" I demanded. "Haven't you noticed yet, Bella? Edward's just the teeniest bit prone to overreaction." Jasper had silently erased all the panic and tension in my body with his curious talent of controlling emotional atmospheres. I'd felt reassured and let them talk me out of my desperate pleading. Of course, that calm had worn off as soon as Edward and I had walked out of the room. So the consensus was that I was just supposed to forget that a deranged vampire was stalking me, intent on my death, go about my business. I did try, and surprisingly, there were other things almost as stressful to dwell on besides my status on the endangered species list. Because Edward's response had been the most frustrating of them all. "That's between you and Carlyle," he'd said. "Of course, you know that I'm willing to make it between you and me at any time that you wish. You know my condition." And he had smiled angelically. I did know his condition. Edward had promised that he would change me himself whenever I wanted, just as long as I was married to him first. Sometimes I wondered if he was only pretending that he couldn't read my mind. How else had he struck upon the one condition that I would have trouble accepting? The one condition that would slow me down. All in all, a very bad week. And today was the worst day in it. It was always a bad day when Edward was away. Alice had foreseen nothing out of the ordinary this weekend, and so I'd insisted that he take the opportunity to go hunting with his brothers. I knew how it bored him to hunt the easy nearby prey. Go have fun, I told him. Bag a few mountain lions for me. I would never admit to him how hard it was for me when he was gone. How it brought back the abandonment nightmares. If he knew that, it would make him feel horrible and he would be afraid to ever leave me, even for the most necessary reasons. It had been like that in the beginning, when he'd first returned from Italy. His golden eyes had turned black, and he had suffered from his thirst more than it was already necessary that he suffer. So I put on a brave face, and all but kicked him out the door whenever Emmett and Jasper wanted to go. I think he saw through me, a little. This morning there had been a note left on my pillow. I'll be back so soon you won't have time to miss me. Look after my heart. I've left it with you. So now I had a big empty Saturday with nothing but my morning shift at Newton's Olympic Outfitters to distract me. And, of course, the oh-so-comforting promise from Alice. I'm staying close to home to hunt. I'll only be 15 minutes away if you need me. I'll keep an eye out for trouble. Translation, don't try anything funny just because Edward's gone. Alice was certainly just as capable of crippling my truck as Edward was. I tried to look on the bright side. After work, I had plans to help Angela with her announcements, so that would be a distraction. And Charlie was in an excellent mood due to Edward's absence, so I might as well enjoy that while it lasted. Alice would spend the night with me if I was pathetic enough to ask her to. And then tomorrow, Edward would be home. I would survive. Not wanting to be ridiculously early for work, I ate my breakfast slowly. One Cheerio at a time. Then, when I'd washed the dishes, I arranged the magnets on the fridge into a perfect line. Maybe I was developing obsessive-compulsive disorder. The last two magnets, round black utilitarian pieces that were my favorites, they could hold 10 sheets of paper to the fridge without breaking a sweat. They did not want to cooperate with my fixation. Their polarities were reversed. Every time I tried to line the last one up, the other jumped out of place. For some reason, impending mania perhaps, this really irritated me. Why couldn't they just play nice? Stupid with stubbornness, I kept shoving them together as if I was expecting them to suddenly give up. I could have flipped one over, but that felt like losing. Finally, exasperated at myself more than the magnets, I pulled them from the fridge and held them together with two hands. It took a little effort. They were strong enough to put up a fight. But I forced them to coexist side by side. See, I said out loud, talking to inanimate objects, never a good sign. That's not so horrible, is it? I stood there, like an idiot for a second, not quite able to admit that I wasn't having any lasting effect against scientific principles. Then, with a sigh, I put the magnets back on the fridge, a foot apart. There's no need to be so inflexible, I muttered. It was still too early, but I decided I'd better get out of the house before the inanimate objects started talking back. When I got to Newton's, Mike was methodically dry mopping the aisles while his mum arranged a new counter display. I caught them in the middle of an argument, unaware that I had arrived. But it's the only time Tyler can go, Mike complained. You said after graduation... You're just going to have to wait, Mrs. Newton snapped. You and Tyler can think of something else to do. You are not going to Seattle until the police stop whatever it is that is going on there. I know Beth Crowley's told Tyler the same thing, so don't act like I'm the bad guy. Oh, good morning, Bella, she said when she caught sight of me, brightening her tone quickly. You're early. Karen Newton was the last person I'd think to ask for help in an outdoor sports equipment store. Her perfectly highlighted blonde hair was always smoothed into an elegant twist on the back of her neck. Her fingernails were polished by professionals, as were her toenails, visible through the strappy high heels that didn't resemble anything Newton offered on the long row of hiking boots. Light traffic, I joked as I grabbed my hideous, fluorescent orange vest from under the counter. I was surprised that Mrs. Newton was as worked up about this Seattle thing as Charlie. I thought he was going to extremes. Well, Mrs. Newton hesitated for a moment, playing uncomfortably with a stack of flyers she was arranging by the register. I stopped with one arm in my vest. I knew that look. When I'd let the Newtons know that I wouldn't be working here this summer, abandoning them in their busiest season in effect, they'd started training Katie Marshall to take my place. They couldn't really afford both of us on the payroll at the same time, so when it looked like a slow day... I was going to call, Mrs. Newton continued. I don't think we were expecting a ton of business today. Mike and I can probably handle things. I'm sorry you got up and drove out. On a normal day, I would be ecstatic with this turn of events. Today, not so much. Okay, I sighed. My shoulders slumped. What was I going to do now? That's not fair, Mum. If Bella wants to work... No, it's okay, Mrs. Newton. Really, Mike, I've got finals to study for and stuff. I didn't want to be a source of familial discord when they were already arguing. Thanks, Bella. Mike, you missed aisle 4. Bella, do you mind throwing these flyers in a dumpster on the way out? I told the girl who left them there I'd put them on the counter, but I really don't have the room. Sure, no problem. I put my vest away and tucked the flyers under my arm and headed out into the misty rain. The dumpster was around the side of Newton's, next to where we employees were supposed to park. I shuffled along, kicking pebbles petulantly on my way. I was about to fling the stack of bright yellow papers into the trash when the heading printed in bold across the top caught my eye. One word in particular seized my attention. I clutched the papers in both hands as I stared at the picture beneath the caption. A lump rose in my throat. Save the Olympic wolf. Under the words, there was a detailed drawing of a wolf in front of a fir tree, its head thrown back in the act of baying at the moon. It was a disconcerting picture. Something about the wolf's plaintive posture made him look forlorn, like he was howling in grief. And then I was running to my truck, the flyers still locked in my grip. 15 minutes. That's all I had. But it should be long enough. It was only 15 minutes to the push, and surely I would cross the boundary line a few minutes before I hit the town. My truck roared to life without any difficulty. Alice couldn't have seen me doing this because I hadn't been planning on it. A snap decision. That was the key. As long as I moved fast enough, I should be able to capitalize on it. I'd thrown the damp flyers in my haste and they were scattered in a bright mess across the passenger seat. 100 bolded captions, 100 dark, howling wolves outlined against the yellow background. I barreled down the wet highway, turning the windshield wipers on high and ignoring the groan of the ancient engine. 55 was the most I could coax out of my truck, and I prayed it would be enough. I had no clue where the boundary line was, but I began to feel safer as I passed the first houses outside the push. This must be beyond where Alice was allowed to follow. I'd call her when I got to Angela's this afternoon, I reasoned, so she'd know I was fine. There was no reason for her to get worked up. She didn't need to be mad at me. Edward would be angry enough for two when he got back. My truck was positively wheezing by the time it grated to a stop in front of the familiar faded red house. The lump came back to my throat as I stared at the little place that had once been my refuge. It had been so long since I'd been here. Before I could cut the engine, Jacob was standing in the door, his face blank with shock. In the sudden silence when the truck roar died, I heard him gasp. "Bella? Hey, Jake." "Bella," he yelled back, and the smile I'd been waiting for stretched across his face like the sun breaking free of the clouds. His teeth gleamed bright against his russet skin. "I can't believe it." He ran to the truck and half yanked me through the open door, and then we were both jumping up and down like kids. "How did you get here?" I snuck out. "Awesome." "Hey, Bella." Billy had rolled himself into the doorway to see what the commotion was about. "Hey, Bill." Just then my air choked off. Jacob grabbed me up in a bear hug, too tight to breathe, and swung me around in a circle. "Wow, it's good to see you here." "Can't breathe," I gasped. He laughed and put me down. "Welcome back, Bella," he said, grinning. And the way he said the words made it sound like, "Welcome home." We started walking, too keyed up to sit still in the house. Jacob was practically bouncing as he moved, and I had to remind him a few times that my legs weren't 10 feet long. As we walked, I felt myself settling into another version of myself, the self I had been with Jacob. A little younger, a little less responsible. Someone who might, on occasion, do something really stupid for no good reason. Our exuberance lasted through the first few topics of conversation. How we were doing, what we were up to, how long I had, what had brought me here. When I hesitantly told him about the wolf flyer, his bellowing laugh echoed back from the trees. But then, as we ambled past the back of the store and shoved through the thick scrub that ringed the far edge of First Beach, we got to the hard parts. All too soon, we had to talk about the reason behind our long separation, and I watched as the face of my friend hardened into the bitter mask that was already too familiar. "So, what's the story anyway?" Jacob asked me, kicking a piece of driftwood out of his way with too much force. It sailed over the sand and clattered against the rocks. "I mean, since the last time before, He struggled for the words. He took a deep breath and tried again. "What I'm asking is, everything is just back to the way it was before he left. You forgave him for all of that?" I took a deep breath. There was nothing to forgive. I wanted to skip past this part, the betrayals, the accusations, but I knew that we had to talk it through before we'd be able to move on to anything else. Jacob's face puckered up like he'd just licked a lemon. "I wish Sam had taken a picture when he found you," that night last September. It would be Exhibit A. Nobody's on trial. Maybe somebody should be. Not even you would blame him for leaving, if you knew the reason why. He glared at me for a few seconds. Okay, he challenged acidly. Amazed me. His hostility was wearing on me, chafing against the raw. It hurt to have him angry with me. It reminded me of the bleak afternoon, long ago when, under orders from Sam, he'd told me we couldn't be friends. I took a second to compose myself. Edward left me last fall because he didn't think I should be hanging out with vampires. He thought it would be healthier for me if he left. Jacob did a double take. He had to scramble for a minute. Whatever he'd been planning to say, it clearly no longer applied. I was glad he didn't know the catalyst behind Edward's decision. I could only imagine what he'd think if he knew Jasper had tried to kill me. He came back though, didn't he? Jacob muttered. Too bad he can't stick to a decision. If you remember, I went and got him. Jacob stared at me for a moment, and then he backed off. His face relaxed, and his voice was calmer when he spoke. That's true. So, I never did get the story. What happened? I hesitated, biting my lip. Is it a secret? His voice took on a taunting edge. Are you not allowed to tell me? No, I snapped. It's just a really long story. Jacob smiled, arrogant, and turned to walk up the beach, expecting me to follow. It was no fun being with Jacob if he was going to act like this. I trailed behind him automatically, not sure if I shouldn't turn around and leave. I was going to have to face Alice, though, when I got home. I suppose I wasn't in any rush. Jacob walked to a huge, familiar piece of driftwood. An entire tree, roots and all, bleached white, beached deep in the sand. It was our tree, in a way. Jacob sat down on the natural bench and patted the space next to him. I don't mind long stories. Was there any action? I rolled my eyes as I sat next to him. There's some action, I allowed. It wouldn't be real horror without action. Horror, I scoffed. Can you listen, or will you be interrupting me with rude comments about my friends? He pretended to lock his lips and then threw the invisible key over his shoulder. I tried not to smile, and failed. I'll have to start with the stuff you were already there for, I decided, working to organize the stories in my head before I began. Jacob raised his hand. Go ahead. That's good, he said. I didn't understand much that was going on at the time. Yeah, well, it gets complicated, so pay attention. You know how Alice sees things? I took his scowl. The wolves weren't thrilled that the legends of vampires possessing supernatural gifts were true, for a yes, and proceeded with the account of my race through Italy to rescue Edward. I kept it as succinct as possible, leaving out anything that wasn't essential. I tried to read Jacob's reactions, but his face was enigmatic as I explained how Alice had seen Edward plan to kill himself when he'd heard I was dead. Sometimes Jacob seemed so deep in thought, I wasn't sure if he was listening. He only interrupted one time. The fortune-telling bloodsucker can't see us? He echoed, his face fierce and gleeful. Seriously? That's excellent. I clenched my teeth together. We sat in silence, his face expectant as he waited for me to continue. I glared at him until he realized his mistake. "Oops," he said. "Sorry." He locked his lips again. His response was easier to read when I got to the part about the Volturi. His teeth clenched together, goosebumps rose on his arms, and his nostrils flared. I didn't go into specifics, I just told him that Edward had talked us out of trouble, without revealing the promise we'd had to make, or the visit we were anticipating. Jacob didn't need to have my nightmares. "Now you know the whole story," I concluded. "So it's your turn to talk. What happened while I was with my mum this weekend?" I knew Jacob would give me more details than Edward had. He wasn't afraid of scaring me. Jacob leaned forward, instantly animated. "So, Embry and Quill and I were running patrol on Saturday night, just routine stuff, when out of nowhere, bam, he threw his arms out, impersonating an explosion. There it is, a fresh trail, not 15 minutes old. Sam wanted us to wait for him, but I didn't know you were gone, and I didn't know if your bloodsuckers were keeping an eye on you or not, so we took off after her at full speed. But she'd crossed the treaty line before we caught up. We spread out along the line, hoping she'd cross back over. It was frustrating, let me tell you." He wagged his head, and his hair, growing out from the short crop he had adopted when he joined the pack, flopped into his eyes. "We ended up too far south. The Cullens chased her back to our side just a few miles north of us. Would have been the perfect ambush if we'd known where to wait." He shook his head, grimacing. "That's when it got dicey. Sam and the others caught up to her before we did, but she was dancing right along the line. The whole coven was right there on the other side. The big one, what's his name? Emmett. Yeah, him. He made a lunge for her, but that redhead is fast. He flew right behind her and almost rammed into Paul, so Paul, well, you know Paul. Yeah. Lost his focus. Can't say I blame him. Big bloodsucker was right on top of him. He sprang. Hey, don't give me that look. The vampire was on our land." I tried to compose my face so that he would go on. My nails were digging into my palms with the stress of the story, even though I knew it had turned out fine. Anyway, Paul missed, and the big one got back on his side, but by then the blonde, Jacob's expression was a comical mix of disgust and unwilling admiration as he tried to come up with a word to describe Edward's sister. Rosalie? Whatever, she got real territorial, so Sam and I fell back to get Paul's flanks. Then their leader and the other blonde male, Carlisle and Jasper, he gave me an exasperated look. You know, I don't really care. Anyway, so Carlisle spoke to Sam, trying to calm things down. Then it was weird, because everyone got really calm, really fast. It was that other one you told me about, messing with our heads. But even though we knew what he was doing, we couldn't not be calm. Yeah, I know how that feels. Really annoying, that's how it feels. Only you can't be annoyed until afterwards. He shook his head angrily. So Sam and the head vamp agreed that Victoria was the priority, and we started after her again. Carlisle gave us the line so that we could follow the scent properly, but she hit the cliffs north of Maca country, right where the line hugs the coast for a few miles. She took off into the water again. The big one and the calm one wanted permission to cross the line to go after her, but of course we said no. Good. I mean, you were being stupid, but I'm glad. Emmett's never cautious enough. He could have gotten hurt. Jacob snorted. So did your vampire tell you we attacked for no reason and his totally innocent coven? No, I interrupted. Edward told me the same story, just without quite as many details. Jacob said under his breath, and he bent over to pick up a rock from among the millions of pebbles at our feet. With a casual flick, he sent it flying a good 100 meters out into the bay. Well, she'll be back, I guess. We'll get another shot at her. I shuddered. Of course she would be back. Would Edward really tell me next time? I wasn't sure. I'd have to keep an eye on Alice, to look for the signs that the pattern was about to repeat. Jacob didn't seem to notice my reaction. He was staring across the waves with a thoughtful expression on his face, his broad lips pursed. What are you thinking about? I asked after a long, quiet time. Thinking about what you told me. About when the fortune teller saw you cliff jumping and thought you'd committed suicide. How it all got out of control. Do you realize that if you had just waited for me like you were supposed to, then Alice wouldn't have been able to see you jump? Nothing would have changed. We'd probably be in my garage right now, like any other Saturday. There wouldn't be any vampires in Forks and you and me. He trailed off, deep in thought. It was disconcerting the way he said this. Like it would be a good thing to have no vampires in Forks. My heart thumped unevenly at the emptiness of the picture he painted. Edward would have come back anyway. You sure about that? He asked, belligerent, as soon as I spoke Edward's name. Being apart, it didn't work out so well for either of us. He started to say something angry from his expression, but he stopped himself, took a breath, and began again. Did you know Sam's mad at you? Me? It took me a second. Oh, I see. He thinks they would have stayed away if I wasn't here? No, that's not it. What's his problem then? Jacob leaned down to scoop up another rock. He turned it over and over in his fingers, his eyes were riveted on the black stone while he spoke in a low voice. And Sam saw how you were in the beginning, when Billy told them how Charlie worried when you didn't get better, and then when you started jumping off cliffs. I made a face. No one was ever going to let me forget that. Jacob's eyes flashed up to mine. He thought you were the one person in the world with as much reason to hate the Cullens as he does. Sam feels sort of betrayed. That you would just let them back into your life like they never hurt you. I didn't believe for a second that Sam was the only one who felt that way. And the acid in my voice now was for both of them. You can tell Sam to go right to... Look at that. Jacob interrupted me, pointing to an eagle in the act of plummeting down toward the ocean from an incredible height. It checked itself at the last minute, only its talons breaking the surface of the waves, just for an instant. Then it flapped away, its wings straining against the load of the huge fish it had snagged. You see it everywhere, Jacob said, his voice suddenly distant. Nature taking its course. Hunter and prey. The endless cycle of life and death. I didn't understand the point of the nature lecture. I guessed he was just trying to change the subject, but then he looked down at me with dark humor in his eyes. And yet you don't see the fish trying to plant a kiss on the eagle. You never see that. He grinned a mocking grin. I grinned back tightly, though the acid taste was still in my mouth. Maybe the fish was trying, I suggested. It's hard to tell what a fish is thinking, eagles are good-looking birds, you know. Is that what it comes down to? His voice was abruptly sharper. Good looks. Don't be stupid, Jacob. Is it the money, then? He persisted. That's nice, I muttered, getting up from the tree. I'm flattered that you think so much of me. I turned my back on him and paced away. Don't get mad. He was right behind me. He caught my wrist and spun me around. I'm serious. I'm trying to understand here, and I'm coming up blank. His eyebrows pushed together angrily, and his eyes were black in their deep shadow. I love him, not because he's beautiful or because he's rich. I spat the word at Jacob. I'd much rather he weren't either one. It would even out the gap between us just a little bit, because he'd still be the most loving and unselfish and brilliant and decent person I've ever met. Of course, I love him. How hard is it to understand? It's impossible to understand. Please enlighten me then, Jacob. I let the sarcasm flow thick. What is a valid reason for someone to love someone else, since apparently I'm doing it wrong? I think the best place to start would be to look within your own species. That usually works. Well, that just sucks, I snapped. I guess I'm stuck with Mike Newton after all. Jacob flinched back and bit his lip. I could see that my words had hurt him, but I was too mad to feel bad about that yet. He dropped my wrist and folded his arms across his chest, turning from me to glare towards the ocean. I'm human, he muttered, his voice almost inaudible. You're not as human as Mike, I continued ruthlessly. Do you still think that's the most important consideration? It's not the same thing. Jacob didn't look away from the grey waves. I didn't choose this. I laughed once in disbelief. Do you think Edward did? He didn't know what was happening to him any more than you did. He didn't exactly sign up for this. Jacob was shaking his head back and forth with a small, quick movement. You know, Jacob, you're awfully self-righteous, considering that you're a werewolf and all. It's not the same, Jacob repeated, glowering at me. I don't see why not. You could be a bit more understanding about the Cullens. You have no idea how truly good they are, to the core, Jacob. He frowned more deeply. They shouldn't exist. Their existence goes against nature. I stared at him for a long moment, with one eyebrow raised incredulously. It was a while before he noticed. What? Speaking of unnatural? I hinted. Bella, he said, his voice slow and different, aged. I realized that he sounded suddenly older than me, like a parent or a teacher. What I am was born in me. It's a part of who I am, who my family is, who we all are as a tribe. It's the reason why we're still here. Besides that, he looked down at me, his black eyes unreadable. I am still human. He picked up my hand and pressed it to his fever-warm chest. Through his t-shirt, I could feel the steady beating of his heart under my palm. Normal humans can't throw motorcycles around the way you can. He smiled a faint half-smile. Normal humans run away from monsters, Bella. And I never claimed to be normal. Just human. Staying angry with Jacob was too much work. I started to smile as I pulled my hand away from his chest. "You look plenty human to me," I allowed. "At the moment, I feel human." He stared past me, his face far away. His lower lip trembled and he bit down on it hard. "Jake," I whispered, reaching for his hand. This was why I was here. This was why I would take whatever reception waited for me when I got back. Because underneath all the anger and the sarcasm, Jacob was in pain. Right now, it was very clear in his eyes. I didn't know how to help him, but I knew I had to try. It was more than that I owed him. It was because his pain hurt me too. Jacob had become a part of me, and there was no changing that now. "Are you okay, Jake? Charlie said you were having a hard time. Isn't it getting any better?" His warm hand curled around mine. "It's not so bad," he said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. We walked slowly back to the driftwood bench, staring at the rainbow-colored pebbles. He pulled me along at his side. I sat back down on our tree, but he sat on the wet, rocky ground rather than next to me. I wondered if it was so that he could hide his face more easily. He kept my hand. I started babbling to fill the silence. "It's been so long since I was here, I probably missed a ton of things. How are Sam and Emily, and Embry? Did Quill?" I broke off mid-sentence, remembering that Jacob's friend Quill had been a sensitive subject. "Ah, Quill," Jacob sighed. "So then it must have happened. Quill must have joined the pack." "I'm sorry," I mumbled. To my surprise, Jacob snorted. "Don't say that to him." "What do you mean?" "Quill's not looking for pity. Just the opposite. He's jazzed. Totally thrilled." This made no sense to me. All the other wolves had been so depressed at the idea of their friend sharing their fate. "Huh?" Jacob tilted his head back to look at me. He smiled and rolled his eyes. "Quill thinks it's the coolest thing that's ever happened to him. Part of it is finally knowing what's going on, and he's excited to have his friends back, to be part of the in crowd." Jacob snorted again. "Shouldn't be surprised, I guess. It's so Quill." "He likes it?" "Honestly, most of them do," Jacob admitted slowly. "There are definitely good sides to this. The speed, the freedom, the strength, the sense of family. Sam and I are the only ones who ever felt really bitter, and Sam got past that a long time ago, so I'm the crybaby now." Jacob laughed at himself. There were so many things that I wanted to know. Why are you and Sam different? What happened to Sam anyway? What's his problem? The questions tumbled out of me, without room to answer them. And Jacob laughed again. "It's a long story." "I told you a long story. Besides, I'm not in any hurry to get back." I grimaced as I thought of the trouble I would be in. He looked up at me swiftly, hearing the double edge in my words. "Will he be mad at you?" "Yeah," I admitted. "He really hates it when I do things he considers risky. Like hanging out with werewolves." "Yeah." Jacob shrugged. So don't go back. I'll sleep on the couch. That's a great idea, I grumbled, because then he would come looking for me. Jacob stiffened and then smiled bleakly. Would he? If he was afraid I was hurt or something, probably. My idea's sounding better all the time. Please, Jake, that really bugs me. What does? That you two are so ready to kill each other. It makes me crazy. Why can't you both just be civilized? Is he ready to kill me? Jacob asked with a grim smile, unconcerned by my anger. Not like you seem to be. I realized I was yelling. At least he can be a grown-up about this. He knows that hurting you would hurt me, and so he never would. You don't seem to care about that at all. Yeah, right, Jacob muttered. I'm sure he's quite the pacifist. Oh, I ripped my hand out of his and shoved his head away. I pulled my knees up to my chest and wrapped my arms tightly round them. I glared out toward the horizon, fuming. Jacob was quiet for a few minutes. Finally, he got up off the ground and sat beside me, putting his arm around my shoulders. I shook it off. Sorry, he said quietly. I'll try to behave myself. I didn't answer. Do you still want to hear about Sam? He offered. I shrugged. Like I said, it's a long story and very strange. There's so many strange things about this new life, I haven't had time to tell you the half of it. And this thing with Sam, I don't know if I'll even be able to explain it right. His words pricked my curiosity in spite of my irritation. I'm listening, I said stiffly. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the side of his face pull up in a smile. Sam had it so much harder than the rest of us, because he was the first, and he was alone. And he didn't have anyone to tell him what was happening. Sam's grandfather died before he was born. His father had never been around. There was no one there to recognize the signs. The first time it happened, the first time he phased, he thought he'd gone insane. It took him 2 weeks to calm down enough to change back. This was before you came to Forks, so you wouldn't remember. Sam's mother and Leah Clearwater had the forest rangers searching for him, the police. People thought there had been an accident or something. Leah? I asked, surprised. Leah was Harry's daughter. Hearing her name sent an automatic surge of pity through me. Harry Clearwater, Charlie's lifelong friend, had died of a heart attack this past spring. His voice changed, became heavier. Yeah, Leah and Sam were high school sweethearts. They started dating when she was just a freshman. She was frantic when he disappeared. But he and Emily, I'll get to that. It's part of the story, he said. He inhaled slowly, and then exhaled in a gust. I suppose it was silly for me to imagine that Sam had never loved anyone before Emily. Most people fall in and out of love many times in their lives. It was just that I had seen Sam with Emily and I couldn't imagine him with someone else. The way he looked at her, well, it reminded me of a look I'd seen sometimes in Edward's eyes when he was looking at me. Sam came back, Jacob said, but he wouldn't talk to anyone about where he'd been. Rumors flew that he was up to no good mostly, and Then Sam happened to run into Quill's grandfather one afternoon when old Quill the Terror came to visit Mrs. Uli. Sam shook his hand. Old Quill just about had a stroke. Jacob paused to laugh. Why? Jacob put his hand on my cheek and pulled my face around to look at him. He was leaning toward me. His face was just a few inches away. His palm burned my skin like he had a fever. Oh, right, I said. It was uncomfortable having my face so close to his with his hand hot against my skin. Sam was running a temperature. Jacob laughed again. Sam's hand felt like he had left it sitting on a hot stovetop. He was so close. I could feel his warm breath. I reached up casually to take his hand away and free my face, but wound my fingers through his so that I wouldn't hurt his feelings. He smiled and leaned back, undeceived by my attempt at nonchalance. So Mr. Atera went straight to the other elders. They were the only ones left who still knew, who remembered. Mr. Atera, Billy, Harry had actually seen their grandfathers make the change. When old Quill told them, they met with Sam secretly and explained. It was easier when he understood, when he wasn't alone anymore. They knew he wouldn't be the only one affected by the Cullens' return. He pronounced the name with unconscious bitterness. But no one else was old enough, so Sam waited for the rest of us to join him. The Cullens had no idea, I said in a whisper. They didn't think that werewolves still existed here. They didn't know that coming here would change you. Doesn't change the fact that it did. Remind me not to get on your bad side. You think I should be as forgiving as you are? We can't all be saints and martyrs. Grow up, Jacob. I wish I could, he murmured quietly. I stared at him, trying to make sense of his response. What? Jacob chuckled. One of those many strange things I mentioned. You can't grow up, I said blankly. You're what? Not aging? Is that a joke? Nope. He popped his lips on the P. I felt blood flood my face. Tears of rage filled my eyes, my teeth mashed together with an audible grinding sound. Bella, what did I say? I was on my feet again, my hands balled up into fists, my whole frame shaking. You are not aging, I growled through my teeth. Jacob tugged my arm gently, trying to make me sit. None of us are. What's wrong with you? Am I the only one who has to get old? I get older every stinking day, I nearly shrieked, throwing my hands in the air. Some little part of me recognized that I was throwing a Charlie-esque fit, but that rational part was greatly overshadowed by the irrational part. Damn it. What kind of world is this? Where's the justice? Take it easy, Bella. Shut up, Jacob. Just shut up. This is so unfair. Did you seriously just stamp your foot? I thought girls only did that on TV. I growled unimpressively. It's not as bad as you seem to think it is. Sit down, I'll explain. I'll stand. He rolled his eyes. Okay, whatever you want. But listen, I will get older someday. Explain. He patted the tree. I glowered for a second, but then sat. My temper had burned out as suddenly as it had flared, and I had calmed down enough to realize I was making a fool of myself. When we get enough control to quit, when we stop phasing for a solid length of time, we age again. It's not easy. He shook his head, abruptly doubtful. It's going to take a really long time to learn that kind of restraint, I think. Even Sam's not there yet. Of course, it doesn't help that there's a huge coven of vampires right down the road. We can't even think about quitting when the tribe needs protectors. But you shouldn't get all bent out of shape about it, because I'm already older than you. Physically, at least. What are you talking about? Look at me, Bells. Do I look 16? I glanced up and down his mammoth frame, trying to be unbiased. Not exactly, I guess. Not at all, because we reach full growth inside of a few months when the werewolf gene gets triggered. It's one hell of a growth spurt. Physically, I'm probably 25 or something, so there's no need for you to freak out about being too old for me at least another 7 years. 25 or something. The idea messed with my head, but I remembered that growth spurt. I remembered watching him shoot up and fill out right before my eyes. I remembered how he would look different from one day to the next. I shook my head, feeling dizzy. So did you want to hear about Sam, or did you want to scream at me some more for things that are out of my control? I took a deep breath. Sorry. Age is a touchy subject for me. That hit a nerve. Jacob's eyes tightened. He looked as if he was trying to decide how to word something. Since I didn't want to talk about the truly touchy stuff, my plans for the future, treaties that might be broken by said plans, I prompted him. So once Sam understood what was going on, once you had Billy and Harry, Mr. Atera, you said it wasn't so hard anymore. Like you also said there are cool parts? I hesitated briefly. Why does Sam hate them so much? Why does he wish I would hate them? Jacob sighed. This is the really weird part. I'm a pro at weird. Yeah, I know. He grinned before continuing. So, you're right. Sam knew what was going on, and everything was almost okay. In most ways, his life was back to, well, not normal, but better. Jacob's expression tightened like something painful was coming. Sam couldn't tell Leah. We aren't supposed to tell anyone who doesn't have to know. And it wasn't really safe for him to be around her, but he cheated. Just like I did with you. Leah was furious that he wouldn't tell her what was going on, where he'd been, where he went at night, why he was always so exhausted. But they were working it out. They were trying. They really loved each other. Did she find out? Is that what happened? He shook his head. No, that wasn't the problem. Her cousin, Emily Young, came down from the Maca reservation to visit her one weekend. I gasped. Emily's Leah's cousin? Second cousins. They're close, though. They were like sisters when they were kids. That's horrible. How could Sam... I trailed off, shaking my head. Don't judge him just yet. Did anyone ever tell you... Have you ever heard of imprinting? Imprinting? I repeated the unfamiliar word. No, what's that mean? It's one of those bizarre things we have to deal with. doesn't happen to everyone. In fact, it's the rare exception, not the rule. Sam had heard all the stories by then, the stories we all used to think were legends. He'd heard of imprinting, but he never dreamed. "What is it?" I prodded. Jacob's eyes strayed to the ocean. Sam did love Leah, but when he saw Emily, that didn't matter anymore. Sometimes, we don't exactly know why we find our mates that way. His eyes flashed back to me, his face reddening. I mean, our soulmates. What way? Love at first sight? I snickered. Jacob wasn't smiling. His dark eyes were critical of my reaction. It's a little bit more powerful than that. More absolute. Sorry, I muttered. You're serious, aren't you? Yeah, I am. Love at first sight, but more powerful? My voice still sounded dubious, and he could hear it. It's not easy to explain. It doesn't matter anyway. He shrugged indifferently. You wanted to know what happened to Sam, to make him hate the vampires for changing him, to make him hate himself. And that's what happened. He broke Leah's heart. He went back on every promise he'd ever made her. Every day, he has to see the accusation in her eyes and know she's right. He stopped talking abruptly, as if he'd said something he didn't mean to. How did Emily deal with this if she was so close to Leah? Sam and Emily were utterly right together, two puzzle pieces, shaped for each other exactly. Still, how had Emily got past the fact that he had belonged to someone else? Her sister, almost. She was real angry in the beginning. It's hard to resist that level of communication and adoration. And then Sam could tell her everything. There are no rules that can bind you when you find your other half. You know how she got hurt? Yeah. The story in Forks was that she was mauled by a bear, but I was in on the secret. Werewolves are unstable, Edward had said. The people near them get hurt. Well, weirdly enough, that was sort of how they resolved things. Sam was so horrified, so sickened by himself, so full of hate for what he'd done. He would have thrown himself under a bus if it would have made her feel better, but he might have anyway, just to escape what he'd done. He was shattered. Then, somehow, she was the one comforting him, and after that, Jacob didn't finish his thought, and I sensed the story had gotten too personal to share. Poor Emily, I whispered. Poor Sam, poor Leah. Yeah, Leah got the worst end of the stick. She puts on a brave face. She's going to be a bridesmaid. I gazed away through the jagged rocks that rose from the ocean, like stubby, broken-off fingers on the south rim of the harbor. I tried to make sense of it all. I could feel his eyes on my face, waiting for me to say something. Did it happen to you? I finally asked. This love at first sight thing? No, he answered briskly. Sam and Jared are the only ones. I said, trying to sound only politely interested. I was relieved, and I tried to explain my reaction to myself. I decided I was just glad he didn't claim there was some mystical, wolfy connection between the two of us. Our relationship was confusing enough as it was. I didn't need any more of the supernatural than I already had to deal with. He was quiet, too, and the silence felt a little awkward. My intuition told me that I didn't want to hear what he was thinking. "How did that work out for Jared?" I asked to break the silence. No drama there. It was just a girl he'd sat next to in school every day for a year and never looked at twice. And then, after he changed, he saw her again and never looked away. Kim was thrilled. She'd had a huge crush on him. She'd had his last name tacked onto the end of hers all over in her diary. He laughed mockingly. I frowned. "Did Jared tell you that?" "He shouldn't have." Jacob bit his lip. "I guess I shouldn't laugh. It was funny, though." "Some soulmate." He sighed. "Jared didn't tell us anything on purpose. I already told you this part, remember?" "Oh yeah, you can hear each other's thoughts, but only when you're wolves, right?" "Right. Just like your bloodsucker," he glowered. "Edward," I corrected. Sure. That's how come I know so much about how Sam felt. It's not like he would have told us all that if he had a choice. Actually, that's something we all hate. The bitterness was abruptly harsh in his voice. It's awful. No privacy, no secrets. Everything you're ashamed of, laid out for everyone to see. He shuddered. "It sounds horrible," I whispered. "It is sometimes helpful when we need to coordinate. Once in a blue moon when some bloodsucker crosses into our territory. The rom was fun. And if the Cullens hadn't gotten in our way last Saturday, we could have had her." His fists clenched into angry balls. I flinched. As much as I worried about Jasper or Emmett getting hurt, it was nothing like the panic I felt at the idea of Jacob going up against Victoria. Emmett and Jasper were the closest thing to indestructible I could imagine. Jacob was still warm, still comparatively human. Mortal. I thought of Jacob facing Victoria, her brilliant hair blowing around her oddly feline face, and shuddered. Jacob looked up at me with a curious expression. "But isn't it like that for you all the time, having him in your head?" "Oh, no, Edward's never in my head. He only wishes." Jacob's expression became confused. "He can't hear me," I explained, my voice a tiny bit smug from old habit. "I'm the only one like that for him. We don't know why he can't." "Weird," Jacob said. "Yeah," the smugness faded. "Probably means there's something wrong with my brain," I admitted. "I already knew there was something wrong with your brain," Jacob muttered. "Thanks." The sun broke through the clouds suddenly, a surprise I hadn't been expecting, and I had to narrow my eyes against the glare off the water. Everything changed color. The waves turned from grey to blue, the trees from dull olive to brilliant jade, and the rainbow-hued pebbles glittered like jewels. We squinted for a moment, letting our eyes adjust. There were no sounds besides the hollow roar of the waves that echoed from every side of the sheltered harbour, the soft grinding of the stones against each other under the water's movement, and the cry of gulls high overhead. It was very peaceful. Jacob settled closer to me, so that he was leaning against my arm. He was so warm. After a minute of this, I shrugged out of my rain jacket. He made a little sound of contentment in the back of his throat and rested his cheek on top of my head. I could feel the sun heat my skin, though it was not quite as warm as Jacob, and I wondered idly how long it would take me to burn. Absent-mindedly, I twisted my right hand to the side. and watched the sunlight glitter subtly off the scar James had left there. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured. "The sun. It's nice." "What are you thinking about?" I asked. He chuckled to himself. "I was remembering that moronic movie you took me to, and Mike Newton puking all over everything." I laughed too, surprised by how time had changed the memory. It used to be one of stress, of confusion. So much had changed that night, and now I could laugh. It was the last night Jacob and I had had before he had learned the truth about his heritage. The last human memory. An oddly pleasant memory now. "I miss that," Jacob said. "The way it used to be so easy. Uncomplicated. I'm glad I've got a good memory," he sighed. He felt the sudden tension in my body as his words triggered a memory of my own. "What is it?" he asked. "About that good memory of yours?" I pulled away from him so that I could read his face. At the moment, it was confused. "Do you mind telling me what you were doing Monday morning? You were thinking something that bothered Edward." Bothered wasn't quite the word for it, but I wanted an answer, so I thought it was best not to start out too severely. Jacob's face brightened with understanding, and he laughed. "I was just thinking about you. Didn't like that much, did he?" "Me? What about me?" Jacob laughed with a harder edge this time. "I was remembering the way you looked that night Sam found you. I've seen it in his head. It's like I was there. That memory has always haunted Sam, you know. And then I remembered how you looked the first time you came to my place. I bet you don't even realize what a mess you were then, Bella. It was weeks before you started to look human again. And I remembered how you always used to have your arms wrapped around yourself, trying to hold yourself together." Jacob winced and shook his head. "It's hard for me to remember how sad you were, and it wasn't my fault. So I figured it would be harder for him, and I thought he ought to get a look at what he'd done." I smacked his shoulder. It hurt my hand. "Jacob Black, don't you ever do that again. Promise me you won't." "No way, I haven't had that much fun in months." "So help me, Jake." "Oh, get a grip, Bella. When am I ever going to see him again? Don't worry about it." I got to my feet, and he caught my hand as I started to walk away. I tried to tug free. "I'm leaving, Jacob." "No, don't go yet," he protested, his hand tightening around mine. "I'm sorry, and... okay, I won't do it again. Promise." I sighed. "Thanks, Jake." "Come on, we'll go back to my house," he said eagerly. "Actually, I think I really do need to go. Angela Weber's expecting me, and I know Alice is worried. I don't want to upset her too much." "But you just got here." "It feels that way," I agreed. I glared up at the sun, somehow already directly overhead. How had the time passed so quickly? His eyebrows pulled down over his eyes. "I don't know when I'll see you again," he said in a hurt voice. "I'll come back the next time he's away," I promised impulsively. "Away?" Jacob rolled his eyes. It's a nice way to describe what he's doing. Disgusting parasites. "If you can't be nice, I won't come back at all," I threatened, trying to pull my hand free. He refused to let me go. "Ah, don't be mad," he said, grinning. "Knee-jerk reaction. If I'm gonna try and come back again, you're gonna have to get something straight, okay?" He waited. "See, I don't care who's a vampire and who's a werewolf. That's irrelevant. You are Jacob, and he is Edward, and I am Bella. Nothing else matters." His eyes narrowed slightly. "But I am a werewolf," he said unwillingly. "And he is a vampire," he added with obvious revulsion. "And I'm a Virgo," I shouted, exasperated. He raised his eyebrows, measuring my expression with curious eyes. Finally, he shrugged. "If you can really see it that way, I can. I do. Okay, just Bella and Jacob. None of those freaky Virgos here." He smiled at me, the warm, familiar smile that I had missed so much. I felt the answering smile spread across my face. "I've really missed you, Jake," I admitted impulsively. "Me too." His smile widened. His eyes were happy and clear, free for once of the angry bitterness. "More than you know. Will you come back soon?" "As soon as I can," I promised. As I drove home, I wasn't paying much attention to the road that shimmered wetly in the sun. I was thinking about the flood of information Jacob had shared with me, trying to sort it out, to force it all to make sense. Despite the overload, I felt lighter. Seeing Jacob smile, having all the secrets thrashed out, it didn't make things perfect, but it made them better. I was right to have gone. Jacob needed me, and obviously, I thought as I squinted into the glare. There was no danger. It came out of nowhere. One minute there was nothing but bright highway in my rearview mirror. The next minute, the sun was glinting off a silver Volvo right on my tail. "Oh, crap," I whimpered. I considered pulling over, but I was too much of a coward to face him right away. I'd been counting on some prep time, and having Charlie nearby as a buffer. At least that would force him to keep his voice down. The Volvo followed inches behind me. I kept my eyes on the road ahead. Chicken through and through, I drove straight to Angela's without once meeting the gaze that I could feel, burning a hole in my mirror. He followed me until I pulled to the curb in front of the Weber's house. He didn't stop, and I didn't look up as he passed. I didn't want to see the expression on his face. I ran up the short concrete walk to Angela's door as soon as he was out of sight. Ben answered the door before I could finish knocking, like he'd been standing right behind it. "Hey, Bella," he said, surprised. "Hi, Ben. Is Angela here?" I wondered if Angela had forgotten our plans and cringed at the thought of going home early. "Sure," Ben said just as Angela called, "Bella," and appeared at the top of the stairs. Ben peered around me as we both heard the sound of a car on the road. The sound didn't scare me. The engine stuttered to a stop, followed by the loud pop of a backfire. Nothing like the purr of the Volvo. This must be the visitor Ben had been waiting for. "Austin's here," Ben said as Angela reached his side. A horn honked on the street. "I'll see you later," Ben promised. "Miss you already." He threw his arm around Angela's neck and pulled her face down to his height so he could kiss her enthusiastically. After a second of this, Austin honked again. "Bye, Ange, love you," Ben shouted as he dashed past me. Angela swayed, her face slightly pink, then recovered herself and waved until Ben and Austin were out of sight. Then she turned to me and grinned ruefully. "Thank you for doing this, Bella," she said. "From the bottom of my heart. Not only are you saving my hands from permanent injury, you also just spared me 2 long hours of a plotless, badly dubbed martial arts film." She sighed in relief. "Happy to be of service." I was feeling a bit less panicked. able to breathe a little more evenly. It felt so ordinary here. Angela's easy human dramas were oddly reassuring. It was nice to know that life was normal somewhere. I followed Angela up the stairs to her room. She kicked toys out of the way as she went. The house was unusually quiet. "Where's your family?" "My parents took the twins to a birthday party in Port Angeles. I can't believe you're really going to help me with this. Ben's pretending he has tendinitis." She made a face. "I don't mind at all," I said. And then I walked into Angela's room and saw the stacks of waiting envelopes. "Oh," I gasped. Angela turned to look at me, apologies in her eyes. I could see why she'd been putting this off, and why Ben had weaseled out. "I thought you were exaggerating," I admitted. "I wish. Are you sure you want to do this?" "Put me to work. I've got all day." Angela divided a pile in half and put her mother's address book between us on her desk. For a while we concentrated, and there was just the sound of our pens scratching quietly across the paper. "What's Edward doing tonight?" she asked after a few minutes. My pen dug into the envelope I was working on. "Emmett's home for the weekend. They're supposed to be hiking." "You say that like you're not sure." I shrugged. "You're lucky Edward has his brothers for all the hiking and camping. I don't know what I would do if Ben didn't have Austin for guy stuff." "Yeah, the outdoors thing's not really for me, and there's no way I'd ever be able to keep up." Angela laughed. "I prefer the indoors myself." She focused on her pile for a minute. I wrote out 4 more addresses. There was never any pressure to fill a pause with meaningless chatter around Angela. Like Charlie, she was comfortable with silence. But, like Charlie, she was also too observant sometimes. "Is something wrong?" she asked in a low voice. "You seem anxious." I smiled sheepishly. "Is it that obvious?" "Not really." She was probably lying to make me feel better. "You don't have to talk about it, unless you want to," she assured me. "I'll listen if you think it'll help." I was about to say thanks but no thanks. After all, there were just too many secrets I was bound to keep. I really couldn't discuss my problems with someone human. That was against the rules. And yet, with a strange sudden intensity, that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted to talk to a normal, human girlfriend. I wanted to moan a little bit, like any other teenage girl. I wanted my problems to be that simple. It would also be nice to have someone outside the whole vampire-werewolf mess to put things in perspective. Someone unbiased. "I'll mind my own business," Angela promised, smiling down at the address she was working on. "No," I said. "You're right. I am anxious. It's Edward. What's wrong?" It was so easy to talk to Angela. When she asked a question like that, I could tell that she wasn't just morbidly curious or looking for gossip like Jessica would have been. She cared that I was upset. "Oh, he's mad at me." "That's hard to imagine," she said. "What's he mad about?" I sighed. "Do you remember Jacob Black?" "Ah," she said. "Yeah. He's jealous." "No, not jealous." I should have kept my mouth shut. There was no way to explain this right, but I wanted to keep talking anyway. I hadn't realized I was so starved for human conversation. "Edward thinks Jacob is a bad influence, I guess. Sort of dangerous. You know how much trouble I got in a few months back? It's all ridiculous, though. I was surprised to see Angela shaking her head. What? I asked. Bella, I've seen how Jacob Black looks at you. I'd bet the real problem's jealousy. It's not like that with Jacob. For you, maybe, but for Jacob? I frowned. Jacob knows how I feel. I've told him everything. Edward's only human, Bella. He's gonna react like any other boy. I grimaced. I didn't have a response for that. She patted my hand. He'll get over it. I hope so. Jake's going through kind of a tough time. He needs me. You and Jacob are pretty close, aren't you? Like family, I agreed. And Edward doesn't like him. That must be hard. I wonder how Ben would handle that, she mused. I half smiled. Probably just like any other boy. She grinned. Probably. Then she changed the subject. Angela wasn't one to pry, and she seemed to sense that I couldn't say any more. I got my dorm assignment yesterday. The farthest building from campus, naturally. Does Ben know where he's staying yet? The closest dorm to campus. He's got all the luck. How about you? Did you decide where you're going? I stared down, concentrating on the clumsy scrawl of my handwriting. For a second, I was distracted by the thought of Angela and Ben at the University of Washington. They would be off to Seattle in just a few months. Would it be safe then? Would the wild young vampire menace have moved elsewhere? Would there be a new place by then? Some other city, flinching from horror movie headlines? Would those new headlines be my fault? I tried to shake it off and answered her question a beat late. Alaska, I think. The university there in Juneau. I could hear the surprise in her voice. Alaska? Oh, really? I mean, that's great. I just figured you'd go somewhere warmer. I laughed a little, still staring at the envelope. Yeah, Forks has really changed my perspective on life. And Edward? Though his name set butterflies fluttering in my stomach, I looked up and grinned at her. Alaska's not too cold for Edward, either. She grinned back. Of course not. And then she sighed. It's so far, you won't be able to come home very often. I'll miss you. Will you email me? A swell of quiet sadness crashed over me. Maybe it was a mistake to get closer to Angela now. But wouldn't it be sadder still to miss out on these last chances? I shook off the unhappy thoughts so that I could answer her teasingly. If I can type after this, I nodded toward the stack of envelopes I'd done. We laughed, and it was easy then to chat cheerfully about classes and majors while we finished the rest. All I had to do was not think about it. Anyway, there were more urgent things to worry about today. I helped her put the stamps on. I was afraid to leave. How's your hand? She asked. I flexed my fingers. I think I'll recover the full use of it, someday. The door banged downstairs and we both looked up. Ange? Ben called. I tried to smile, but my lips trembled. I guess that's my cue to leave. You don't have to go, though he's probably going to describe the movie for me in detail. Charlie'll be wondering where I am anyway. Well, thanks for helping me. I had a good time, actually. We should do something like this again. It was nice to have some girl time. Definitely. There was a light knock on the bedroom door. Come in, Ben, Angela said. I got up and stretched. Hey, Bella, you survived. Ben greeted me quickly before going to take my place by Angela. He eyed our work. Nice job. Too bad there's nothing left to do. I would have... He let the thought trail off and then restarted excitedly. Ange, I can't believe you missed this one. It was awesome. There was this final fight sequence. The choreography was unbelievable. This one guy, well, you're going to have to see it to know what I'm talking about. And Angela rolled her eyes at me. See you at school, I said with a nervous laugh. She sighed. See you. I was jumpy on the way out to my truck, but the street was empty. I spent the whole drive glancing anxiously in all my mirrors, but there was never any sign of the silver car. His car was not in front of the house either, though that meant little. Bella? Charlie called when I opened the front door. Hey, Dad. I found him in the living room, in front of the TV. So, how was your day? Good, I said. Might as well tell him everything. He'd hear it from Billy soon enough. Besides, it would make him happy. They didn't need me at work, so I went down to La Push. There wasn't enough surprise in his face. Billy had already talked to him. How's Jacob? Charlie asked, attempting to sound indifferent. Good, I said, just as casual. You get over to the Webbers? Yep, we got all her announcements addressed. That's nice. Charlie smiled a wide smile. He was strangely focused, considering that there was a game on. I'm glad you spent some time with your friends today. Me too. I ambled toward the kitchen, looking for busy work. Unfortunately, Charlie had already cleaned up his lunch. I stood there for a few minutes, staring at the bright patch of light the sun made on the floor. But I knew I couldn't delay this forever. I am going to go study, I announced glumly as I headed up the stairs. See you later, Charlie called after me. If I survive, I thought to myself. I shut my bedroom door carefully before I turned to face my room. Of course he was there. He stood against the wall across from me, in the shadow beside the open window. His face was hard, and his posture tense. He glared at me wordlessly. I cringed, waiting for the torrent, but it didn't come. He just continued to glare, possibly too angry to speak. Hi, I finally said. His face could have been carved from stone. I counted to 100 in my head, but there was no change. So I'm still alive, I began. A growl rumbled low in his chest, but his expression didn't change. No harm done, I insisted with a shrug. He moved. His eyes closed and he pinched the bridge of his nose between the fingers of his right hand. Bella, do you have any idea how close I came to crossing the line today? To breaking the treaty and coming after you? Do you know what that would have meant? I gasped, and his eyes opened. They were as cold and hard as night. You can't, I said too loudly. I worked to modulate the volume of my voice so Charlie wouldn't hear, but I wanted to shout the words. Edward, they'd use any excuse for a fight. They'd love that. You can't ever break the rules. Maybe they aren't the only ones who would enjoy a fight. Don't you start, I snapped. You made the treaty, you stick to it. If he had hurt you. Enough, I cut him off. There's nothing to worry about. Jacob isn't dangerous. Bella, he rolled his eyes. You aren't exactly the best judge of what is or isn't dangerous. I know I don't have to worry about Jake, and neither do you. He ground his teeth together. His hands were balled up in fists at his sides. He was still standing against the wall, and I hated the space between us. I took a deep breath and crossed the room. He didn't move when I wrapped my arms around him. Next to the warmth of the last of the afternoon sun streaming through the window, his skin felt especially icy. He seemed like ice too, frozen the way he was. Sorry I made you anxious, I muttered. He sighed and relaxed a little. His arms wound around my waist. Anxious is a bit of an understatement, he murmured. It was a very long day. You weren't supposed to know about it. I thought you'd be hunting for longer. I looked up at his face, at his defensive eyes. I hadn't noticed in the stress of the moment, but they were too dark. The rings under them were deep purple. I frowned in disapproval. When Alice saw you disappear, I came back, he explained. You shouldn't have done that. Now you'll have to go away again. My frown intensified. I can wait. That's ridiculous. I mean, I know she couldn't see me with Jacob, but you should have known. But I didn't, he broke in. And you can't expect me to let you. Yes, I can, I interrupted him. That's exactly what I expect. This won't happen again. That's right, because you're not going to overreact next time, and because there isn't going to be a next time. I understand when you have to leave, even if I don't like it. That's not the same. I'm not risking my life. Neither am I. Werewolves constitute a risk. I disagree. I'm not negotiating this, Bella. Neither am I. His hands were in fists again. I could feel them against my back. The words popped out thoughtlessly. Is this really just about my safety? What do you mean? He demanded. You aren't... Angela's theory seemed sillier now than before. It was hard to finish the thought. I mean, you know better than to be jealous, right? He raised one eyebrow. Do I? Be serious. Easily. There's nothing remotely humorous about this. I frowned suspiciously. Or is this something else altogether, like some vampire and werewolves are always enemies nonsense? Is this a testosterone-fueled... His eyes blazed. This is only about you. All I care is that you're safe. The black fire in his eyes was impossible to doubt. Okay, I sighed. I believe that. But I want you to know something. When it comes to all this enemies nonsense, I'm out. I am a neutral country. I am Switzerland. I refuse to be affected by territorial disputes between mythical creatures. Jacob is family. You're, well, not exactly the love of my life, because I expect to love you for much longer than that. The love of my existence. I don't care who's a werewolf and who's a vampire. If Angela turns out to be a witch, she can join the party too. He stared at me, silently through narrowed eyes. Switzerland, I repeated again for emphasis. He frowned at me, and then sighed. Bella, he began. but he paused, and his nose wrinkled in disgust. What now? Well, don't be offended, but you smell like a dog. And then he smiled crookedly. So I knew the fight was over. For now. Edward had to make up for the missed hunting trip, so he was leaving Friday night with Jasper, Emmett, and Carlisle to hit some reserve in Northern California with a mountain lion problem. We'd come to no agreement on the werewolf issue, but I didn't feel guilty calling Jake during my brief window of opportunity when Edward took the Volvo home before climbing back in through my window, to let him know I'd be coming over on Saturday again. It wasn't sneaking around. Edward knew how I felt, and if he broke my truck again, then I'd have Jacob pick me up. Forks was neutral, just like Switzerland, just like me. So when I got off work Thursday, and it was Alice rather than Edward waiting for me in the Volvo, I was not suspicious at all. The passenger door was open, and music I didn't recognize was shaking the frame when the bass played. "Hey Alice," I shouted over the wailing as I climbed in. "Where's your brother?" She was singing along to the song, her voice an octave higher than the melody, weaving through it with a complicated harmony. She nodded at me, ignoring my question as she concentrated on the music. I shut my door and put my hands over my ears. She grinned and turned the volume down until it was just the background. Then she hit the locks and the gas in the same second. "What's going on?" I asked, starting to feel uneasy. "Where's Edward?" She shrugged. "They left early." "Oh." I tried to control the absurd disappointment. If he left early, that meant he'd be back sooner, I reminded myself. "All the boys went, and we're having a slumber party," she announced in a trilling, sing-song voice. "A slumber party?" I repeated, the suspicion finally settling in. "Aren't you excited?" she crowed. I met her animated gaze for a second. "You're kidnapping me, aren't you?" She laughed and nodded. "Till Saturday." Esme cleared it with Charlie. "You're staying with me 2 nights, and I'll drive you to and from school tomorrow." I turned my face to the window, my teeth grinding together. "Sorry," Alice said, not sounding in the least bit penitent. "He paid me off." "How?" I hissed through my teeth. "The Porsche. It's exactly like the one I stole in Italy." She sighed happily. "I'm not supposed to drive it around Forks, but if you want, we could see how long it takes to get from here to LA. I bet you I could have you back by midnight." I took a deep breath. "I think I'll pass," I sighed, repressing a shudder. We wound, always too fast, down the long drive. Alice pulled around to the garage, and I quickly looked over the cars. Emmett's big Jeep was there with a shiny canary yellow Porsche between it and Rosalie's red convertible. Alice hopped out gracefully and went to stroke her hand along the length of her bribe. "Pretty, isn't it?" "Pretty over the top," I grumbled, incredulous. "He gave you that just for 2 days of holding me hostage?" Alice made a face. A second later, comprehension came and I gasped in horror. "It's for every time he's gone, isn't it?" She nodded. I slammed my door and stomped toward the house. She danced along next to me, still unrepentant. "Alice, don't you think this is just a little bit controlling? Just a tiny bit psychotic, maybe?" "Not really," she sniffed. "You don't seem to grasp how dangerous a young werewolf can be, especially when I can't see them. Edward has no way to know you're safe. You shouldn't be so reckless." My voice turned acidic. "Yeah, because a vampire slumber party is the pinnacle of safety-conscious behavior." Alice laughed. "I'll give you a pedicure and everything," she promised. It wasn't so bad, except for the fact that I was being held against my will. Esme brought Italian food. the good stuff, all the way from Port Angeles, and Alice was prepared with my favorite movies. Even Rosalie was there, quietly in the background. Alice did insist on the pedicure, and I wondered if she was working from a list, maybe something she'd compiled from watching bad sitcoms. "How late do you want to stay up?" she asked, when my toenails were glistening a bloody red. Her enthusiasm remained untouched by my mood. "I don't want to stay up. We have school in the morning." She pouted. "Where am I supposed to sleep anyway?" I measured the couch with my eyes. It was a little short. "Can't you just keep me under surveillance at my house?" "What kind of slumber party would that be?" Alice shook her head in exasperation. "You're sleeping in Edward's room." I sighed. His black leather sofa was longer than this one. Actually, the gold carpet in his room was probably thick enough that the floor wouldn't be half bad either. "Can I go back to my place to get my things at least?" She grinned. "Already taken care of." "Am I allowed to use your phone?" "Charlie knows where you are." I wasn't going to call Charlie. I frowned. "Apparently I have some plans to cancel." "Oh," she deliberated. "I'm not sure about that." "Alice," I whined loudly. "Come on." Okay, she said, flitting from the room. She was back in half a second, cell phone in hand. "You didn't specifically prohibit this," she murmured to herself as she handed it to me. I dialed Jacob's number, hoping he wasn't out running with his friends tonight. Luck was with me. Jacob was the one to answer. "Hello?" "Hey Jake, it's me." Alice watched me with expressionless eyes for a second, before she turned and went to sit between Rosalie and Esme on the sofa. "Hi Bella," Jacob said, suddenly cautious. "What's up?" "Nothing good. I can't come over Saturday after all." It was silent for a minute. "Stupid bloodsuckers," he finally muttered. "I thought he was leaving. Can't you have a life when he's gone, or does he lock you in a coffin?" I laughed. "I don't think that's funny." "I'm only laughing because you're close," I told him. "But he's going to be here Saturday, so it doesn't matter." "Will he be feeding there in Forks then?" Jacob asked cuttingly. No, I didn't let myself get irritated with him. I wasn't that far from being as angry as he was. He left early. "Oh, well, come over now then," he said with sudden enthusiasm. "It's not that late, or I'll come up to Charlie's." "I wish I'm not at Charlie's," I said sourly. Kind of being held prisoner. He was silent as that sunk in, and then he growled. "We'll come and get you," he promised in a flat voice, slipping automatically into a plural. A chill slid down my spine, but I answered in a light and teasing voice. "Tempting. I have been tortured." Alice painted my toenails. "I'm serious." "Don't be. They're just trying to keep me safe." He growled again. "I know it's silly, but their hearts are in the right place." "Their hearts," he scoffed. "Sorry about Saturday," I apologized. "I've got to hit the sack." "The couch," I corrected mentally. "But I'll call you again soon." "Are you sure they'll let you?" he asked in a scathing tone. "Not completely," I sighed. "Night, Jake. See you around." Alice was abruptly at my side, her hand held out for the phone, but I was already dialing. She saw the number. "I don't think he'll have his phone on him," she said. "I'll leave a message." The phone rang 4 times, followed by a beep. There was no greeting. "You are in trouble," I said slowly, emphasizing each word. "Enormous trouble. Angry, grizzly bears are going to look tame next to what is waiting for you at home." I snapped the phone shut and placed it in her waiting hand. "I'm done." She grinned. "This hostage stuff is fun." "I'm going to sleep now," I announced, heading for the stairs. Alice tagged along. "Alice, I'm not going to sneak out. You would know if I was planning to, and you'd catch me if I tried." "I'm just going to show you where your things are," she said innocently. Edward's room was at the farthest end of the third-floor hallway, hard to mistake even when the huge house had been less familiar. But when I switched the light on, I paused in confusion. Had I picked the wrong door? Alice giggled. It was the same room, I realized quickly. The furniture had just been rearranged. The couch was pushed to the north wall, and the stereo shoved up against the vast shelves of CDs to make room for the colossal bed that now dominated the central space. The southern wall of glass reflected the same back like a mirror, making it look twice as bad. It matched. The coverlet was dull gold, just lighter than the walls. The frame was black, made of intricately patterned wrought iron. Sculpted metal roses wound in vines up the tall posts and formed a bowery lattice overhead. My pajamas were folded neatly on the foot of the bed, my bag of toiletries to one side. "The hell is all this?" I spluttered. "You didn't really think he would make you sleep on the couch, did you?" I mumbled unintelligibly as I stalked forward to snatch my things off the bed. "I'll give you some privacy," Alice laughed. "See you in the morning." After my teeth were brushed and I was dressed, I grabbed a puffy feather pillow off the huge bed and dragged the gold cover to the couch. I knew I was being silly, but I didn't care. Porsches as bribes and king-sized beds in houses where nobody slept. It was beyond irritating. I flipped off the lights and curled up on the sofa, wondering if I was too annoyed to sleep. In the dark, the glass wall was no longer a black mirror, doubling the room. The light of the moon brightened the clouds outside the window. As my eyes adjusted, I could see the diffused glow highlighting the tops of the trees and glinting off a small slice of the river. I watched the silver light, waiting for my eyes to get heavy. There was a light knock on the door. "What, Alice?" I hissed. I was on the defensive, imagining her amusement when she saw my makeshift bed. "It's me," Rosalie said softly, opening the door enough that I could see the silver glow touch her perfect face. "Can I come in?" Rosalie hesitated in the doorway, her breathtaking face unsure. "Of course," I replied, my voice an octave high with surprise. "Come on in." I sat up, sliding to the end of the sofa to make room. My stomach twisted nervously as the one Cullen who did not like me moved silently to sit down in the open space. I tried to come up with a reason why she would want to see me, but my mind was a blank on that point. "Do you mind talking to me for a few minutes?" she asked. "I didn't wake you or anything, did I?" Her eyes shifted to the stripped bed and back to my couch. "No, I was awake. Sure, we can talk." I wondered if she could hear the alarm in my voice as clearly as I could. She laughed lightly, and it sounded like a chorus of bells. "He so rarely leaves you alone," she said. "I figured I'd better make the best out of this opportunity." What did she want to say that couldn't be said in front of Edward? My hands twisted and untwisted around the edge of the comforter. "Please don't think I'm horribly interfering," Rosalie said, her voice gentle and almost pleading. She folded her hands in her lap and looked down at them as she spoke. I'm sure I've hurt your feelings enough in the past, and I don't want to do that again. Don't worry about it, Rosalie. My feelings are great. What is it? She laughed again, sounding oddly embarrassed. I'm going to try to tell you why I think you should stay human. Why I would stay human if I were you. Oh. She smiled at the shocked tone of my voice, and then she sighed. Did Edward ever tell you what led to this? She asked, gesturing to her glorious, immortal body. I nodded slowly, suddenly somber. He said it was close to what happened to me that time in Port Angeles. Only no one was there to save you. I shuddered at the memory. Is that really all he told you? She asked. Yes, I said, my voice blank with confusion. Was there more? She looked up at me and smiled. It was a harsh, bitter, but still stunning expression. Yes, she said. There was more. I waited while she stared out the window. She seemed to be trying to calm herself. Would you like to hear my story, Bella? It doesn't have a happy ending, but which of ours does? If we had happy endings, we'd all be under gravestones now. I nodded, though I was frightened by the edge in her voice. I lived in a different world than you do, Bella. My human world was a much simpler place. It was 1933. I was 18, and I was beautiful. My life was perfect. She stared out the window at the silver clouds, her expression far away. My parents were thoroughly middle class. My father had a stable job in a bank, something I realize now that he was smug about. He saw his prosperity as a reward for talent and hard work, rather than acknowledging the luck involved. I took it all for granted then. In my home, it was as if the Great Depression was only a troublesome rumor. Of course, I saw the poor people, the ones who weren't as lucky. My father left me with the impression that they had brought their troubles on themselves. It was my mother's job to keep our house, and myself and my two younger brothers, in spotless order. It was clear that I was both her first priority and her favorite. I didn't fully understand at the time, but I was always vaguely aware that my parents weren't satisfied with what they had, even if it was so much more than most. They wanted more. They had social aspirations, social climbers, I suppose you could call them. My beauty was like a gift to them. They saw so much more potential in it than I did. They weren't satisfied, but I was. I was thrilled to be me, to be Rosalie Hale. Pleased that men's eyes watched me everywhere I went, from the year I turned 12. Delighted that my girlfriends sighed with envy when they touched my hair. Happy that my mother was proud of me, and that my father liked to buy me pretty dresses. I knew what I wanted out of life, and there didn't seem to be any way that I wouldn't get exactly what I wanted. I wanted to be loved, to be adored. I wanted to have a huge, flowery wedding, where everyone in town would watch me walk down the aisle on my father's arm, and think I was the most beautiful thing they'd ever seen. Admiration was like air to me, Bella. I was silly and shallow, but I was content. She smiled, amused at her own evaluation. My parents' influence had been such that I also wanted the material things of life. I wanted a big house with elegant furnishings that someone else could clean, and a modern kitchen that someone else would cook in. As I said, shallow, young and very shallow. And I didn't see any reason why I wouldn't get these things. There were a few things I wanted that were more meaningful. One thing in particular. My very closest friend was a girl named Vera. She married young, just 17. She married a man my parents would never have considered for me, a carpenter. A year later, she had a son, a beautiful little boy with dimples and curly black hair. It was the first time I'd ever felt truly jealous of anyone else in my entire life. She looked at me with unfathomable eyes. It was a different time. I was the same age as you, but I was ready for it all. I yearned for my own little baby. I wanted my own house and a husband who would kiss me when he got home from work, just like Vera. Only I had a very different kind of house in mind. It was hard for me to imagine the world that Rosalie had known. Her story sounded more like a fairy tale than history to me. With a slight shock, I realized that this was very close to the world that Edward would have experienced when he was human. The world he had grown up in. I wondered, while Rosalie sat silent for a moment, if my world seemed as baffling to him as Rosalie's did to me. Rosalie sighed, and when she spoke again, her voice was different, the wistfulness gone. In Rochester, there was one royal family, the Kings, ironically enough. Royce King owned the bank my father worked at, and nearly every other really profitable business in town. That's how his son, Royce King II, her mouth twisted around the name. It came out through her teeth. Saw me the first time. He was going to take over at the bank, and so he began overseeing the different positions. 2 days later, my mother conveniently forgot to send my father's lunch to work with him. I remember being confused when she insisted I wear my white organza, roll my hair up, just to run over to the bank. Rosalie laughed, without humor. I didn't notice Royce watching me particularly. Everyone watched me, but that night the first of the roses came. Every night of our courtship he sent a bouquet of roses to me. My room was always overflowing with them. It got to the point that I would smell like roses when I left the house. Royce was handsome too. He had lighter hair than I did, and pale blue eyes. He said my eyes were like violets, and then those started showing up alongside the roses. My parents approved. That's putting it mildly. This was everything they'd dreamed of. And Royce seemed to be everything I'd dreamed of. The fairy tale prince, come to make me a princess. Everything I wanted. Yet it was still no more than I expected. We were engaged before I'd known him for 2 months. We didn't spend a great deal of time alone with each other. Royce told me he had many responsibilities at work, and when we were together, he liked people to look at us, to see me on his arm. I liked that too, There were lots of parties, dancing, pretty dresses. When you were a king, every door was open for you. Every red carpet rolled out to greet you. It wasn't a long engagement. Plans went ahead for the most lavish wedding. I was going to be everything I'd ever wanted. I was completely happy. When I called it Vera's, I no longer felt jealous. I pictured my fair-haired children playing on the huge lawns of the king's estate, and I pitied her. Rosalie broke off suddenly, clenching her teeth together. It pulled me out of her story, and I realized that the horror was not far off. There would be no happy ending, as she'd promised. I wondered if this was why she had so much more bitterness in her than the rest of them. Because she had been within reach of everything she'd wanted, when her human life was cut short. "I was at Vera's that night," Rosalie whispered. Her voice was smooth as marble and as hard. Her little Henry really was adorable. All smiles and dimples. He was just sitting up on his own. Vera walked me to the door as I was leaving, her baby in her arms and her husband at her side, his arm around her waist. He kissed her on the cheek when he thought I wasn't looking. That bothered me. When Royce kissed me, it wasn't quite the same. Not so sweet somehow. I shoved that thought aside. Royce was my prince. Someday I would be queen. It was hard to tell in the moonlight, but it looked like her bone-white face got paler. It was dark in the streets. The lamps already on. I hadn't realized how late it was. She continued to whisper almost inaudibly. It was cold. Very cold for late April. The wedding was only a week away, and I was worrying about the weather as I hurried home. I can remember that clearly. I remember every detail about that night. I clung to it so hard in the beginning. I thought of nothing else. And so I remember this, when so many pleasant memories have faded away completely. She sighed and began whispering again. Yes, I was worrying about the weather. I didn't want to move the wedding indoors. I was a few streets from my house when I heard them. A cluster of men under a broken street lamp, laughing too loud, drunk. I wished I'd called my father to escort me home, but the way was so short. It seemed silly. And then he called my name. "Rose," he yelled, and the others laughed stupidly. I hadn't realized the drunks were so well dressed. It was Royce and some of his friends, sons of other rich men. "Here's my Rose," Royce shouted, laughing with them, sounding just as stupid. "You're late. We're cold. You've kept us waiting so long." I'd never seen him drink before. A toast now and then, a party. He told me he didn't like champagne. I hadn't realized he preferred something much stronger. He had a new friend, the friend of a friend, come up from Atlanta. "What did I tell you, John?" Royce crowed, grabbing my arm, pulling me closer. "Isn't she lovelier than all your Georgia peaches?" The man named John was dark-haired and sun-tanned. He looked me over like I was a horse he was buying. "It's hard to tell," he drawled slowly. "She's all covered up." They laughed, Royce like the rest. Suddenly Royce ripped my jacket from my shoulders. It was a gift from him, popping the brass buttons off. They scattered all over the street. "Show him what you look like, Rose," he laughed again and tore my hat out of my hair. The pins wrenched my hair from the roots and I cried out in pain. They seemed to enjoy that, the sound of my pain. Rosalie looked at me suddenly, as if she'd forgotten I was there. I was sure my face was as white as hers, unless it was green. "I won't make you listen to the rest," she said, quietly. They left me in the street, still laughing as they stumbled away. They thought I was dead. They were teasing Royce that he would have to find a new bride. He laughed and said he'd have to learn some patience first. I waited in the road to die. It was cold, though there was so much pain that I was surprised it bothered me. It started to snow, and I wondered why I wasn't dying. I was impatient for death to come, to end the pain. It was taking so long. Carlyle found me then. He'd smelled the blood and come to investigate. I remember being vaguely irritated as he worked over me, trying to save my life. I'd never liked Dr. Cullen or his wife and her brother, as Edward pretended to be then. It had upset me that they were all more beautiful than I was, especially that the men were. But they didn't mingle in society, so I'd only seen them once or twice. I thought I'd died when he pulled me from the ground and ran with me because of the speed. It felt like I was flying. I remember being horrified that the pain didn't stop. Then I was in a bright room, and it was warm. I was slipping away, and I was grateful as the pain began to dull. But suddenly something sharp was cutting me. My throat, my wrists, my ankles. I screamed in shock, thinking he'd brought me there to hurt me more. Then fire started burning through me, and I didn't care about anything else. I begged him to kill me. When Esme and Edward returned home, I begged them to kill me too. Carlyle sat with me. He held my hand and said that he was sorry, promising that it would end. He told me everything, and sometimes I listened. He told me what he was, what I was becoming. I didn't believe him. He apologized each time I screamed. Edward wasn't happy. I remember hearing them discuss me. I stopped screaming sometimes. Did no good to scream. "What were you thinking, Carlyle?" Edward said. "Rosalie Hale." Rosalie imitated Edward's irritated tone to perfection. I didn't like the way he said my name. Like there was something wrong with me. "I couldn't just let her die," Carlyle said quietly. "It was too much. Too horrible. Too much waste." "I know," Edward said, and I thought he sounded dismissive. It angered me. I didn't know then that he really could see exactly what Carlyle had seen. It was too much waste. I couldn't leave her. "Of course you couldn't," Esme agreed. "People die all the time," Edward reminded him in a hard voice. "Don't you think she's just a little recognizable, though? The Kings will have to put up a huge search, not that anyone suspects the fiend," he growled. It pleased me that they seemed to know that Royce was guilty. I didn't realize that it was almost over, that I was getting stronger, and that was why I was able to concentrate on what they were saying. The pain was beginning to fade from my fingertips. "What are we going to do with her?" Edward said disgustedly, or that's how it sounded to me at least. Carlyle sighed. It's up to her, of course. She may want to go her own way. I'd believed enough of what he'd told me that his words terrified me. I knew that my life was ended, and there was no going back for me. I couldn't stand the thought of being alone. The pain finally ended, and they explained it to me again what I was. This time I believed. I felt the thirst, my hard skin. I saw my brilliant red eyes. Shallow as I was, I felt better when I saw my reflection in the mirror the first time. Despite the eyes, I was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. She laughed at herself for a moment. It took some time before I began to blame the beauty for what had happened to me, for me to see the curse of it, to wish that I had been, well, not ugly, but normal, like Vera, so I could have been allowed to marry someone who loved me and have pretty babies. That's what I'd really wanted, all along. It still doesn't seem like too much to have asked for. She was thoughtful for a moment, and I wondered if she'd forgotten my presence again, but then she smiled at me, her expression suddenly triumphant. You know, my record's almost as clean as Carlyle's, she told me. Better than Esme, 1,000 times better than Edward. I've never tasted human blood, she announced proudly. She understood my puzzled expression as I wondered why her record was only almost as clean. I did murder 5 humans, she told me in a complacent tone. If you can really call them human. But I was very careful not to spill their blood. I knew I wouldn't be able to resist that, and I didn't want any part of them in me, you see. I saved Royce for last. I hoped that he would hear of his friends' deaths and understand, know what was coming for him. I hoped the fear would make the end worse for him. I think it worked. He was hiding inside a windowless room behind a door as thick as a bank vault's, guarded outside by armed men when I caught up with him. Oops, 7 murders, she corrected herself. I forgot about his guards. They only took a second. I was overly theatrical. It was kind of childish, really. I wore a wedding dress I'd stolen for the occasion. He screamed when he saw me. He screamed a lot that night. Saving him for last was a good idea. It made it easier to control myself, to make it slower. She broke off suddenly, and she glanced down at me. I'm sorry, she said in a chagrined voice. I'm frightening you, aren't I? I'm fine, I lied. I got carried away. Don't worry about it. I'm surprised Edward didn't tell you more about it. He doesn't like to tell other people's stories. He feels like he's betraying confidences. He hears so much more than just the parts they mean for him to hear. She smiled and shook her head. I probably ought to give him more credit. He's really quite decent, isn't he? I think so. I can tell. She sighed. I haven't been fair to you either, Bella. Did he tell you why? Or was that too confidential? He said it was because I was human. He said it was harder for you to have someone on the outside who knew. Rosalie's musical laughter interrupted me. Now I really feel guilty. He's been much, much kinder to me than I deserve. She seemed warmer as she laughed, like she had let down some guard that had never been absent in my presence before. What a liar that boy is. She laughed again. He was lying? I asked, suddenly wary. Well, that's probably putting it too strongly. He just didn't tell you the whole story. What he told you was true, even truer now than it was before. However, at the time... She broke off, chuckling nervously. It's embarrassing, you see. At first, I was mostly jealous because he wanted you, and not me. Her words sent a thrill of fear through me. Sitting there in the silver light, she was more beautiful than anything else I could imagine. I could not compete with Rosalie. But you love Emmett, I mumbled. She shook her head back and forth, amused. I don't want Edward that way, Bella. I never did. I love him as a brother. But he's irritated me from the first moment I heard him speak. You have to understand, though, I was so used to people wanting me, and Edward wasn't the least bit interested. It frustrated me, even offended me in the beginning. But he never wanted anyone, so it didn't bother me long. Even when we first met Tanya's clan in Denali, all those females, Edward never showed the slightest preference. And then he met you. She looked at me with confused eyes. I was only half paying attention. I was thinking about Edward and Tanya and all those females, and my lips pressed together in a hard line. Not that you aren't pretty, Bella, she said, misreading my expression. But it just meant he found you more attractive than me. I'm vain enough that I minded. But you said at first, that doesn't still bother you, does it? I mean, we both know you're the most beautiful person on the planet. I laughed at having to say the words. It was so obvious. How odd that Rosalie should need such reassurances. Rosalie laughed too. Thanks, Bella, and no, it doesn't really bother me anymore. Edward's always been a little strange. She laughed again. But you still don't like me, I whispered. Her smile faded. I'm sorry about that. We sat in silence for a moment, and she didn't seem inclined to go on. Would you tell me why? Did I do something? Was she angry I'd put her family, her Emmett, in danger time and time again? James, now Victoria. No, you haven't done anything, she murmured. Not yet. I stared at her, perplexed. Don't you see, Bella? Her voice was suddenly more passionate than before, even while she told her unhappy story. You already have everything. You have a whole life ahead of you. Everything I want. And you're going to just throw it away. Can't you see that I would trade everything I have to be you? You have the choice that I didn't have, and you're choosing wrong. I flinched back from her fierce expression. I realized my mouth had fallen open, and I snapped it shut. She stared at me for a long moment, and slowly the fervor in her eyes dimmed. Abruptly, she was abashed. And I was so sure that I could do this calmly. She shook her head, seeming a little dazed by the flood of emotion. It's just that it's harder now than it was then, when it was no more than vanity. She stared at the moon in silence. It was a few moments before I was brave enough to break into her reverie. Would you like me better if I chose to stay human? She turned back to me, her lips twitching into a hint of a smile. Maybe. You did get some of your happy ending, I reminded her. You got Emmett. I got half, she grinned. You know that I saved Emmett from a bear that was mauling him and carried him home to Carlisle? But can you guess why I stopped the bear from eating him? I shook my head. With the dark curls, the dimples that showed even while he was grimacing in pain, the strange innocence that seemed so out of place on a grown man's face. He reminded me of Vera's little Henry. I didn't want him to die. So much that, even though I hated this life, I was selfish enough to ask Carlisle to change him for me. I got luckier than I deserved. Emmett is everything I would have asked for if I'd known myself well enough to know what to ask for. He's exactly the kind of person someone like me needs. And oddly enough, he needs me too. That part worked out better than I could have hoped. But there will never be more than the two of us. And I'll never sit on a porch somewhere, with him grey-haired by my side, surrounded by our grandchildren. Her smile was kind now. That sounds quite bizarre to you, doesn't it? In some ways, you are much more mature than I was at 18, but in other ways, there are many things you've probably never thought about seriously. You're too young to know what you'll want in 10 years, 15 years. Too young to give it all up without thinking it through. You don't want to be rash about permanent things, Bella. She patted my head, but the gesture didn't feel condescending. I sighed. Just think about it a little. Once it's done, it can't be undone. Esme's made do with us substitutes. Alice doesn't remember anything human, so she can't miss it. You will remember, though. It's a lot to give up. But more to get in return, I didn't say aloud. Thanks, Rosalie. It's nice to understand, to know you better. I apologize for being such a monster, she grinned. I'll try to behave myself from now on. I grinned back at her. We weren't friends yet, but I was pretty sure she wouldn't always hate me so much. I'll let you sleep now. Rosalie's eyes flickered to the bed and her lips twitched. I know you're frustrated that he's keeping you locked up like this, but don't give him too bad a time when he gets back. He loves you more than you know. It terrifies him to be away from you. She got up silently and ghosted to the door. Good night, Bella, she whispered as she shut it behind herself. Good night, Rosalie, I murmured a second too late. It took me a long time to fall asleep after that. And that is where we close the book tonight on this episode of Down to Sleep. And to me, that was a fantastic chapter. It was amazing to get to know Rosalie's character and backstory a bit more. it felt like such a change of pace to the rest of the saga, and I hope that we get to hear more stories. It reminded me of Carlisle's backstory, and I look forward to hearing about more of these characters, because we almost switched perspective even into Rosalie as the narrator of the book. It sort of merged in there, the way that it was written. I actually really enjoyed that story, and I hope that you did too. It was a little bit intense there at times, but gotta say, I loved how it turned out. I hope that you're able to get to sleep after that one, or have a beautiful rest of your day, or whatever you're doing, and have a wonderful weekend. Until next time, thank you for listening, thank you for being here, and good night.